much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who has joined us in the room. We are going to start our meeting. The first presentation will be from Gabriel Garcia. He is a comrade from Mexico, from Chiapas, with a long-standing experience working with the Zapatista movement. Gabriel will be giving us a presentation on the meaning of colonialism and occupation, both in Latin America, throughout Latin America, as well as in Palestine. So I will ask Gabriel to kick off his presentation. Thank you. Gabriel, you have the floor. Yes. Okay. Let's see if I am able to share my screen. Can you confirm that you are able to see my screen? Yes. If you just switch to presentation mode, yes. Are we ready? Yes. Please go ahead, Gabriel. Thank you so much. So, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from wherever you are connecting. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here with us today, and I'd like to express my heartfelt solidarity with the people of Palestine in this very difficult time. As Maria was saying, I want to share about war and colonialism and how colonialism is, as we know today, is emerged here in these lands when when the first Azteca Empire was defeated, and that is where we saw the first colonialism. It is when capitalism started, which led to these expressions that we have seen in recent days, which are nothing new for our lands. They are expressions and things that we've been seeing for more than 500 years. I'd like to start off with this brief text. It's a communique by the Zapatista, and I think it stresses something that very often goes unsaid, and that is that the intention of Netanyahu isn't the main goal is Palestinian children. They want to kill the future generations. They want to end with the survival of a people. And they are leaving very little room for hope. And the only ones who can put an end to this massacre is Israel ending this war. What we are seeing is based on what known as the Dahiya doctrine. It's a Lebanese neighborhood that was attacked by Israel in 2008, incessantly during weeks and weeks. And what we see here are some of the words of the leader of the Israeli army at that time. They said, "We will apply disproportionate force and we will cause a great destruction." They are not civil population, they are military targets, and that we want to destroy infrastructure and cause deep suffering to the population. At that time, the Israeli military was saying that all Lebanese are Nasrallah, referring to one of the military leaders they were fighting against. And now we see how the Dahiya doctrine, which includes the intentional murders of women, children, and elderly, and which is what allows us to say that Israel is a terrorist state. They are saying, Israel is saying that all Palestinians are Hamas. So, therefore, if the war is against Hamas, in their opinion, all Palestinians are part of that war, regardless of their age or any other circumstance. We are seeing the greatest act of ethnic cleansing in the history of this world. These are the words of Francesca Albanese, the UN rapporteur. We experienced this 400 or 500 years ago in what today is called the Americas. It was a huge act of genocide and ethnic cleansing by the European colonizers and conquerors. And what we are seeing is that the Israeli model is a model of reorganizing cruelty and genocide. And here I'd like to go back to the perspective of the Zapatista people when they're saying that global capitalism is based on 4 pillars: exploitation, plundering, disregard, and repression. Through these 4 pillars, they take the land, and this leads to a genocide that is reorganizing the population and the territory. So we have these expressions, these statements from the Israeli military. They're imposing a total siege on Gaza, which has been going on for 12 or 14 years, if I'm not mistaken. And this is because they voted who they wanted to govern them. They're left with no electricity, food, water, or fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting against human animals. Dehumanization are the basis of colonialism. This is one of the basic thoughts behind colonialism. They are dehumanizing human beings. They are taking their human features away from them. And they are trying to get people to believe that some human beings are more human than others, and that only those that are more human than others have lives that are worth living, and it only worth crying for their lives, and that all of those who are subhuman don't even deserve shedding tears. As an Israeli NGO is saying, it is now knowing that soldiers have received orders from their heads to shoot and kill on Palestinian children. So if you are killing the future of a people and the future generation you don't consider as human, that allows us to say that this is a war to conquer the Palestinian people, and there settlers are playing an important role. Sometimes there's a romanticized vision of Israeli settlers. Perhaps you may have seen a TV series in the 80s where it seemed that settlers were all about goodness and tenderness. But what we have in front of us today, these settlements, these Israeli settlements, what they are doing is to use this settler population, which has been, whose minds have been colonized, to allow these crimes against humanity and war crimes to continue on a daily basis. The everyday lives for Palestinians living close to these Israeli settlements, as an Israeli human rights NGO says, B'Tselem is a horrible routine where these settlers impose an unbearable situation for the lives of the Palestinian people. And this is all backed by the state of Israel. We know that propaganda is another fundamental aspect in war. We know that they have to win the hearts and the minds of the people, as happened here in Guatemala and in South America, where there were huge efforts put into propaganda to put the population on their side and to put people against those who were resisting. And we are seeing this happening in Gaza. And this is a lie. They're saying that Israel is at war with Hamas and not with civilians. But as we see in these images, it's quite the opposite. What we are witnessing in the media and in corporate media is that the war is against Hamas. But what we're seeing in these pictures is that the Palestinian people are treated as animals. They're being dehumanized. And the so-called fight for struggle for justice of the side of Israel. But this war is really all about taking the Palestinian lands, to empty Gaza of Palestinian people, as they have been doing throughout Palestine since the state of Israel was created. We all know, I am sure, that in a military conflict, when one of the parties plants their flag, it's because they are taking land. This is an image we see of an Israeli flag flying over one of Gaza's neighborhoods. So Israel is grabbing Palestinian land. It's one of the four pillars of global capitalism, as we said before. Another important thing, and we've seen this happen in Latin America, and especially here in Central America, is that genocide is a social practice. It's not about Netanyahu. It's not about the Israeli government. It's not the generals in their armies alone. It's a whole society that becomes accomplice in the destruction of people. Genocide hasn't only been happening these very painful days. It's a genocide which has been going on for a long time. And this genocide is being supported by Western powers, the Western powers that could perhaps stop Israel are allowing for this genocide to happen. I would say that it's sickening. We've seen Israel knows no limits. The sense of shame among European governments because of the persecution of the Jewish people, it means that they're now allowing Israel to do whatever it wants. And I'd just like to say that the persecution of Jews and Muslims is one of Europe's greatest sports. Even if it's painful to say this, we must say it. Europe has been the main perpetrator of persecution, and we have to hold Europe accountable. There are a few other elements. This quote-unquote official truth is picked up on by Western governments and repeated, as well as by multilateral institutions such as the UN. They are bending and justifying the Israeli discourse. The right to take revenge. This right does not exist in any international instrument. Let's remember, we are talking about an occupying force that, according to the Geneva Convention, cannot do certain things. And among the obligations of the occupying forces is the protection of the civilians in the occupied territories. This final image I want to share with you reflects how Israel is selling military weapons and security products, and how the powers that may limit Israelis' actions are the ones that sell most weapons to Israel: the US, France, Germany, and the UK. So these powers that consider themselves to lead the world are the ones selling the greatest number of arms to Israel. Not just this, we also know how in our territories we have concrete experiences of Israeli tactics against our peoples, the tactics which Israel has learned and the weapons that they use against the Palestinian people are also used against our people.
The vehicles by which our people are disappearing are exactly the same, and the weapons used against Mexicans are many times tested against Palestinian bodies before. Therefore, we are closely linked to each other. And Professor Rasegal, a Jewish professor and historian, says Israel's goal is to destroy Palestinians in Gaza, and those of us observing in the world are not complying, are answering with our responsibility of stopping them from doing this. We have an important responsibility here. We cannot afford dehumanization to keep moving forward. We must think not only about subhumanized and dehumanized people who become dehumanized. Those dehumanizing become less human as well. Nothing about human beings should be indifferent to us. This would be what I had to say and share with you. Thank you very much, my dear colleagues. Thank you very much, Gabriel. People, whoever would like to make a question, please keep them for the end, because we're now going to listen to another colleague, a Palestinian colleague speaking Spanish. So please, Barces, you have the floor. Thank you, Maria. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation.
شكرا جابرييل.
Earlier today, we were watching the news about 9 new attacks on the Gaza school in the Gaza Strip, attack against the school with hundreds, thousands of deaths, people wounded, and maybe you know that the Gaza Strip is currently, for over 6 weeks, it is undergoing an episode of genocide war launched by Israel on the 7th of October. But it's also important to point out that what is happening now is not new. What is happening now has a long standing story of violence and colonization, as well as torture, which already started over 75 years ago. What I would like to talk about today is what's happening in the jails of this colonial regime under the Israeli regime. But what is important to point out is something that is a key idea for me, for us to understand what is happening in the Gaza Strip and also in the West Bank and in the other occupied territories in 1948. We are basically speaking, as Gabriel pointed out, about a long-standing violence story of violence, a project of ethnical cleansing of the Palestinian population. It is very important to bear this story in mind and this history, because it is not possible for us to understand what's going on now without understanding this history of violence, oppression, and torture, which has been going on for so long, which has also been accompanied or which has been finding a strong Palestinian resistance within Palestine and outside of Palestine, always denouncing that this colonial project should not be accepted. And there are many connections between what's happened and what's happening in Latin American territories at the moment. We're also speaking about a long-standing colonialism and colonial violence story in Latin American territories. What's happening in the jails then? And we must also say that what I'm going to explain now, it didn't start 6 weeks ago. It is a long violence and torture story that has been happening in the Israeli jails. Before the 7th of October, there were almost 5,200 political prisoners from Palestine. We're talking about Palestinian prisoners, among whom children, members of parliament, of the Palestinian parliament. We're also speaking about women and men who were imprisoned by the Israeli government. These people are also a part or members of that million of Palestinian people who spent some time in the Israeli jails in the Palestinian territory since 1948. The administration by the Israeli police put these people in their prison cells and took away from them all their personal belongings, and we are talking about even books, pictures, letters from their relatives, pens, any access to water and electricity was cut for them. All cells were closed. We are talking about a situation where prisoners couldn't even go out of their prison cells. They were trapped in their prison cells practically 24 hours, 7 days a week. They could only go out of their prison cell for 15 minutes a day. The Israeli prison administration denied every visit from relatives of these prisoners. No relatives could visit their beloved ones. Nobody was able to receive any visits from their loved ones. A witness is telling us that the Israeli prison administration, with the collaboration of the military regime, was attacking, torturing, and raping prisoners. We're talking about 5 people who were murdered inside of those prisons since the 7th of October. 5 people, with one particular martyr who was killed last week, a martyr who was killed last week. We are speaking about a war that is happening inside of those prisons, an increase of violations of human rights against these prisoners, and also an increase on the volume of the tortures, of the intensity of the tortures that these prisoners are suffering. And the statistics are showing us an understanding, helping us understand how serious the situation is. It's important to understand that before the 7th of October, we had 5,200, and we are now talking about almost 9,000 political prisoners. We're talking about over 2,800 prisoners who were arrested since the 7th of October. But we're also talking about hundreds of Palestinians coming from Jerusalem or coming from territory that we call occupied territory since 1948, who were also arrested by the colonial regime. And we are also talking about an unknown number of prisoners who were arrested. Palestinian prisoners coming from the Gaza Strip who were arrested since the 7th of October. Therefore, we're talking about double-fold the numbers. It has been doubled. The number of prisoners has doubled since then. But there is also redoubling, an increase, an intense increase of violence against these arrested Palestinians and these prisoners, these Palestinian prisoners. It must also be pointed out that what is happening inside those prisons has become a part of this war launched by this colonial government, launched all around the Palestinian territory. It's only one more manifestation of this war, because as you know, there is this discourse trying to point out that what is happening is a crisis of Israeli hostages. But the Palestinian people for over 75 years had been taken as a hostage. Since 1948, we're talking about a population living in territories with colonial regime military presence. And as I said, we're talking about over 1 million people who at some point were spending some time in the Israeli prisons. But the discourse must be changed, because these populations who have been occupied and who are still taken as hostages are the Palestinian people and not the Israeli citizens. We can generally speak about the blockage that is still standing against the Gaza Strip. We can talk about the situation in Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and we can also speak about the way in which this colonial regime is treating the law, wherever there are two separate laws. This regime is going to treat Palestinians, as Gabriel pointed out, as animals, as people, but not human, with no human rights, with a dehumanized discourse coming from the colonial mentality of the Israeli regime, still trying and looking at treating and looking at Palestinian people as inferiors, treating them as people not deserving life and whose death is fully justified. So to sum up what I'm talking about the situation in these prisons where this war, which has been going on for over 6 weeks is also manifesting itself in the form of these treatments, abuse, and tortures in these prisons. It's not the first time that Israel launched all its forces against prisoners and arrested citizens, because they don't only want to carry out a vengeance, but they don't only want to take revenge, but they want to destroy all Palestinian resistance. And they also want to finish out with the Palestinian population altogether, also the Palestinian people in the prisons. So these killings are happening in the prisons, and it is important to talk about it and to keep on speaking about these prisoners, because all Palestinian prisoners are taken as hostages, and one more manifestation of this war is happening inside of these prisons. Israel is now trying to continue forward with its own campaigns, treating Palestinians as targets of their violence and torture, and trying to divide the resistance by Palestinians all around the Palestinian territory. What's happening inside of those prisoners, it's one more sign of the war that is going on. The colonial regime is going on with its practices of violence and torture. We do not know exactly what is happening within the prisons. We are not able. The colonial regime is denying our rights to visit our loved ones in the prisoners, and they are also denying the representatives, the international organizations such as the Red Cross, to access. Also the lawyers, they are being denied to represent the prisoners. So these prisons and the way they are dealt with and managed are along the same lines of this Israeli policy. Since 1948, this colonial regime has been going on, and it's not going to stop. It's never going to stop with any Palestinian presence in our territories. Resistance is important, not only in the Palestinian territories, but also for you who live outside of the territory, because the discourse must be changed. It must be clearly stated that the Palestinian population is not only an occupied population, a population under occupation, living under occupation, but they are also fighting against the colonial military regime. But also this population has been taken as hostage, and it has. This discourse needs to change. This Palestinians are trying to live their daily lives. They are trying to work their lands. They cannot even access their own lands. We need to stop this discourse, always coming together with this colonial violence mentality and mindset. Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much, Basil.
Maria, there is a question from Carmen in the chat.
Okay. I'll call on her in a second. Carmen, usted puede hacer su pregunta.
You can make your question, but I just wanted to say, to explain the people present here, that we are carrying out this webinar in Spanish. However, whoever wants to speak in English, they can, because we have interpretation. What is important here is that we want to spread and share this webinar with our colleagues in Latin America. So this is why I'm thanking these two presentations in Spanish, because I think that these are allowing us to focus not only on what's happening in the Gaza area, but we are also dealing with historical issues. We're also looking at facts, happenings that happened centuries ago, and in the case of our colleagues in Palestine, this is closely linked to that background. Carmen says, can my question be read? She says, thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation on humanism. You think that Europe lets Israeli do whatever they want because of what happened in the Holocaust? Do you think this is the reason why? Only, or do you think there are other geopolitical causes which are sustaining this shameful support to Israelis? Would you like to answer to this question? Yes, thank you, Carmen, for your question. I think that this is not the only cause. I don't even use the word Holocaust anymore because Holocaust is a word coming from Hebrew, meaning sacrifice. So there are some philosophers and thinkers who have, like Georgia Kamen, who have recently been speaking about Auschwitz instead of Holocaust as an expression to describe this human evil, because Holocaust means sacrifice, and the sacrifice entails that the victim of the sacrifice assumes the sacrifice, it assumes it, it accepts it. So it is preferable to call it Auschwitz. I think that part of what Europe is doing, of letting them do what they're doing, and when I say Israelis, I don't mean like the Israelites. Israelites are the, as they are named or mentioned in the Old Testament. No, I'm talking about Israelis. The Second World War was a great capitalist war. It wasn't just a war to occupy vital spaces. It was a capitalist war provoked by Germany. Let's not forget it. And persecution of Jewish populations, of Muslim populations is, excuse the word, please, but I'm using it on purpose. It's a sport, and it's a sarcasm, I know. It's a deeply European sport, persecuting populations, I mean. How European kingdoms were formed, what they called crusades, the so-called crusades, were justifying the attack of Muslim populations, which gave way much beyond religious wars. The generation of commercial routes, trade, generation of technologies, but not only these feelings of guilt have to do with what is happening, so guilt about what happened to the Jewish people, but there are also economic advantages involved. The main weapons providers for Israel are European countries, and also United States is one of the main providers. This is a Eurocentric system. In Europe, we have an increase of racism against Muslim populations, mainly.
This doesn't come from now. So there is a logic or an unconscious racist logic in Europe that is coming up now more than ever before, in a more clearer and open way than before. It's been there for many years, but perhaps it was politically incorrect. But now, with the rise in far-right movements in Europe, we are seeing how racist discourse are shared with no shame. And it is this racist discourse that enables this to happen. It's a very permissive discourse. And it dehumanizes others. Let's not forget that in Europe they talk of blackheads and all sorts of pejorative words for others. So it's not just from the shame over the Holocaust, but others. And let's not forget, there is an economic power. I'm not quite sure how to say this for it not to sound, I mean, you shouldn't feel ashamed about anti-Semitism. There's one group which is profoundly anti-Semitic, and that is those who are actually governing Israel. The Semitic thought is something that characterized all of the inhabitants of the Middle East, and it includes the Palestinian population. Semites does not equivalent to Jews. So there's economic power and political power in the hands of the Jewish population, which generates that economic wealth. And this is also at stake, the economic and political capacity in certain sectors of the population that are contributing to allow this to continue. It's not just a feeling of guilt, even if this guilt is still relevant in Europe. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gabriel. Next, if you do have any questions for Basil, I think he will have to leave in around 12 minutes. He has to leave the meeting. So if you have any question for him, you can ask questions in English, Spanish, or Arabic. One of the goals of our meeting is to learn about what you are doing in your territories to show solidarity with the Palestinian people. So if you'd like to share things, you are more than welcome. You may also ask in Arabic, as someone said in the chat. Yes, we have interpretation into Arabic as well. There is a question from Eduardo asking Basil to give us an update on the victims of the Israeli genocide. Could you do that, Basil? Yes, of course. I'm reading the questions in the chat. So just bear with me for a second.
Okay. Yeah.
Eduardo, I don't quite understand your question. Are you asking me about victims in general outside prisons or just prison victims? Or Eduardo, if you would like to take the floor, you may also take the floor. I'm going to allow Eduardo to take the floor. Please turn on your mic, Eduardo. I think there is another question. So if Eduardo, you can clarify what you were asking. Are you referring about what's going on outside prisons? And then I can move on to Carmen's questions. Well, let's start off answering Carmen's question. And then once Eduardo clarifies what he was intending, I can answer Eduardo's question. Okay? So Carmen is asking about whether other human rights international organizations other than the Red Cross have access to prisons? The answer, the short answer is no. That's the problem, because generally speaking, the Red Cross before October the 7th could access Israeli prisons. And I mean, there are other important things that should be said, and we are all witnessing how international organizations are not meeting their mandates in our territory, because since the outbreak of this episode of genocidal war, Israel denied the Red Cross access to prisons. We are talking of a situation where we do not know, especially when it comes to the prisoners coming from the Gaza Strip. We know nothing about them. We don't know what prisons they are kept in. We don't know how they are health-wise. We don't know what their legal status is. So, Carmen, to answer your question, I'd say no. In theory, before this latest episode, it was only the Red Cross and the lawyers of the prisoners who could access the prison, but now nobody can access these prisons, so we don't know what's happening. We only find out when a prisoner is released from jail, or in those rare cases where a lawyer is allowed to visit 1, 2, or 3 prisoners. And your question, Carmen, also leads me to think about the work done by international human rights organizations. As you know, and we must say this, generally speaking, this war points at the complicity of international organizations with the colonial regime. We're seeing this in the Gaza Strip. Those international organizations that are there to protect civilians are not doing their job. And Israel isn't allowing these international organizations to do their job. Now I am on reading Eduardo's clarification. Eduardo is saying he cannot turn on his microphone. You can now take the floor, Eduardo. Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Basil, for your presentation. I wasn't able to listen to Gabriel. I had connectivity issues, but in any case, I did listen to Basil, and I've tried to stay up to date with what is happening. It's an atrocity. It's a genocide. There's no name to express what is going on. And we can only feel deep pain at what is happening. And one feels hopeless being far from them. There's nothing, when there's such great need for humanitarian aid and support. I'd like to express my solidarity and my pain for what has happened and what continues to happen in Palestine. And I'd also like to have a clear idea on the dimensions of this genocide. That is why I was asking whether Basil could give us an updated figure on the victims of genocide, which has just become worse under the pretext of Hamas's action. I'd like to know what the current figures are. It's important for the population to know exactly what is going on. And the information, the news we are hearing is stabbing away at our deepest feelings. One cannot even imagine and accept what is happening, and we need to express our solidarity with the Palestinian people that is being massacred. Thank you.
Gracias, Eduardo. Sí.
Thank you so much, Eduardo.
Sí, mira, lo que está pasando, como
I mean, what is happening, as you mentioned, and as I also mentioned in my presentation, and as Gabriel said, this is a genocidal war, not just against the Gaza Strip, but throughout the Palestinian territories. In fact, today in a refugee camp close to Nablus, in Balata is the name of the refugee camp. Well, there, the forces of the colonial regime have launched attacks against Palestinians who were seeking shelter in a building in this refugee camp. 5 Palestinians have died. In the West Bank, we are waking up to news of people being arrested and killed by the colonial regime. We have more than 200 people who have been killed since October the 7th in the West Bank, and more than 11,500. And with this horrible Zionist attack against the school, there are many more casualties in the Gaza Strip, more than 11,500, and there are thousands of people who are wounded. Buildings and houses in the Gaza Strip have been severely damaged. And I don't like using this word, but we are witnessing a very serious situation and crisis. People do not have access to food, water, fuel. Your question, Eduardo, is an important one. I started off my presentation saying that we cannot fully understand what is happening and the severity of this colonial genocidal attack against the Palestinian people without understanding that this regime, the colonial regime, has never stopped doing what it's doing now. Generally speaking, this has always been the case in Palestine. Now we're seeing that violence is increased, but ever since the colonial state was established in our territories in a very violent way, they started off with this project, which for myself and other Palestinians, the ultimate goal of this project is the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. This didn't just start when the Palestinian resistance launched a resistance campaign against Israeli territory, against the Israeli regime. Apologies. It started long before. So when we look at the bigger picture, we are then able to see that what is happening, and I'm sad to say this, but also in the West Bank, we are seeing daily attacks. You know, we have settlers who are attacking Palestinian workers in their lands. They are grabbing more and more land and taking control of larger stretches of territories. So when we see that this is a never-ending project, we can understand two things. We can understand the Palestinian resistance since 1948 against this project, and it also allows us to understand that there is the need for people from other parts of the world to echo the voices of the Palestinian people. Things are changing, but we have to continue pushing to change the discourse. We must unmask that the Israeli state is a genocidal state that was created amidst a lot of violence, and this violence continues. So I hope that with that, Eduardo, I've answered your question. Thank you so much, Basil, and thanks for your participation. I believe, as Carmen is saying in the chat, she says, I echo Eduardo's words of the sense of helplessness. So we have acts of solidarity to denounce the situation, to show our solidarity. We have supported the Adwa hospital, but it feels like not much has been done. We send you a big hug from Argentina and keep up the struggle. Okay, Basil, I thank you hugely for being with us. Thank you very much for sharing this time. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Gabriel, and see you soon. Thank you, Basil, for everything. Keep safe. Thank you all. Okay. So next, I will open the floor to other questions and comments. I will allow 10 more minutes for Q&As if the interpreters will allow me to do so. We have other comments. There is a question actually in the chat, further up in the chat. Yeah, if you'd like to read that question out. Vivi is saying, good morning. What are the global consequences? What global consequences would this politics of extermination have, bearing in mind the large number of migrants on the move worldwide? Well, I don't know if anyone wants to answer this question. Hani, would you like to try answering Vivi's question?
Respond, Hani, to that question. Hello.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. It's very difficult to try to predict what will be the consequences of what's going on right now, because it has many factors that will shape the future of Palestine. And one of the most important is the magnitude of support Palestinians may receive from other countries in the region, which is unfortunately is very minimal right now. And the recent Arab Islamic summit failed completely to provide any meaningful suggestions for the future. So with the massive support from the US and Europe, it's very difficult to predict what will happen, but all what we know that Palestinian people will never give up, will never leave their lands. And we need to recognize that when we talk about Palestine, we're not talking about West Bank and Gaza. We talk about 10 million Palestinians outside. So one of the rights that we need to acknowledge as well is the right to return, unconditioned right to return. And I would like also to say that one of the organizations receive massive attacks for a while right now is UNRWA, the United Nations for Palestinian Refugees. And the main cause of that UNRWA provide the refugee status for Palestinians. And this means that Palestinian refugees continue to exist generation after generation. And Trump's son-in-law found this is problematic, and he wanted to get rid of UNRWA to stop this refugee status. And this means that the Palestinians will stop at some point and no more Palestinians. So people who will be born from Palestinian families, they will not be Palestinians officially. So again, it depends on us. It depends on the social movements that will continue to support Palestinian people all over the world. And nobody can predict what will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hani. There's a question from Eduardo. Why does the United States continue to support this? The United States government, some people in the United States government, because even in the government of the United States, there have been people who have asked for a ceasefire. One of the biggest lobbies that there is in the United States is the Jewish Zionist lobby that helps to elect many of the congresspersons in the United States. And this has been going on for years and years. And so this is why you're seeing this polarization, especially among Jewish people, but young Jewish people who are calling for a ceasefire and who are with Jewish Voices for Peace, for example. And I'm speaking English, and the older generation who are more Zionist. Estuve diciendo, Eduardo, que en los Estados Unidos, los
What I'm
que
saying, Eduardo, is that those paying for the campaigns for many of the congressmen are a group of Jewish people who are Zionists, and they invest lots and lots of money in that. They are now getting ready to support people to go against these people who are supporting Palestinian people in the Congress. So they are asking, and these people who are asking for a ceasefire, as long as this powerful group keeps on paying for the support to the Zionist state, the Zionist official position by the United States will be a support for the Zionist state. But some groups are carrying out, like Jewish Voices for Peace are carrying out some work, and some others are also gathering and working for peace. Some are helping people through webinars to call the congressman. Yesterday, there was one of these meetings happening. There was a big group, at least 90 people joining. They took 5 minutes so that they could all call their own congressman during the webinar. So there are actions being taken, but there is also a polarization in the United States about this issue, and this polarization exists in other parts of the world as well. The reason for these, why these webinars are being organized is to, by the People's Health Movement, is so that we can educate people about the reality against the propaganda that we're receiving from the media, from the mass media. It's important to say as well that many journalists have lost their jobs or they stopped working for certain media because they don't agree with what's being communicated by those media. Some academics, some students are being dissidents to the mainstream message. There is a new generation of Jewish people. The young people are going to change the situation because they are in the streets in favor of Palestinian people. Unfortunately, this is not something that we hear or not something that reaches the news. This is why I shared some links in the chat every day. We can find a lot of information that cannot be found in other media. Important information. It's also available in Spanish. This is why I shared the link for both languages. democracynow.org or democracynow.es for Spanish. Al Jazeera is covering greatly what's happening, and there are statistics every week, which are horrifying statistics. But I would recommend you to go to that source of information that source, that website for information. So if you will allow me to answer Eduardo's question, let us remember that there are around 50,000 million yearly dollars being invested in Israel by the US military industry. Therefore, the arms lobby is very, very powerful. Sadly, in the United States, it is a society living off its weapons, and its support to Israel has been a great business to these countries. So there are other big reasons, economic reasons behind this positioning. I would also like to remind our colleagues to visit some YouTube documentaries by Rompeviento TV. A colleague, a journalist, a friend, is on the territory at the moment, and he is carrying out as much as he can, also being careful for his own life, but he's also informing of the daily events in the Palestinian territories, not only in the Gaza Strip, but also he's also informing about what is happening in the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and in Egypt. Also, he's been to Egypt and he's informing. This is also another source of information where we can be informed about what's happening. Regarding the question about global consequences, there will only be global consequences for the Palestinian people when speaking about extermination policies. Extermination policies are carried out against everything that is not considered human. Migrant populations displaced by force. So those forced displacements caused by environment, war, or other causes is affecting millions of people. So I think it's important for us to think about it this way. There is a logic dehumanizing people in general, no matter if they drown in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean is a great graveyard. El Darién is a great big graveyard. Mexico has also become a great graveyard. All of these graveyards are graveyards of non-people, no humans, according to the extermination policy. It is not only a military expression, it is a policy against life. It is an extermination policy against the possibility for people to build conditions of life to be lived in dignity. And Carmen, when you say it might be little, what we can do, yes, it's little, but it's much. It's when there is no light, those little expressions of solidarity are very important. We must not stop showing solidarity, and acting on our solidarity, the worst could happen. So it is very important, even if we feel that it's very little what we can do, even if we think it is, for the population who is being a victim of all of this, it is important that we will keep on doing it. Let's keep on doing it. Thank you very much, Gabriel.
Clara Kim, I am going to answer your message, but I want you to send me your email, please, on the chat. Send me your email on the chat, and I will answer your question. I will get back to you on that. What I know is that the telemedicine is for the future. There can't be telemedicine now because there's no way to reach the people in Gaza with the elimination of the telecommunications. I want to thank everybody who's present today. This has been recorded, and it's in various languages, and so I hope that you will give it send it to lots of people so that other people can learn about the situation from a different point of view than we've heard in the last meetings. Yo quiero agradecer a todas las personas aquí
I would like
presentes
to thank everyone here present for your time, for your solidarity with Palestine. We're going to have recordings of this webinar, and it will be available for you to share it with your contacts. So thank you for your dissemination of the webinar, and thank you to our interpreters. So important for us right now. And I would like to say goodbye to you now. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Gracias, María. Gracias a todas, a todos.
Gracias.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you to everyone.
Gracias también de mi parte.
Thank you also from me.
Miguel o Deepika, se puede terminar la actividad.
Yes. Yeah.
Gracias, Deepika.
Yeah. Bye. Gracias.
Thank you, Deepika.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah. Bye.